You ever see a man get judged before he even speaks? The question didn't come from anyone standing there, but somehow it hung in the air like it belonged to the moment, like the street itself was asking it as the flashing red and blue lights painted the wet asphalt in restless color, as a crowd slowly gathered on the corner of West 53rd and Halsted in Chicago, phones already raised, whispers already forming, and at the center of it all stood Marcus Reed, hands visible, posture steady, eyes calm in a way that didn't match the tension tightening around him, while Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of his patrol car with the kind of confidence that came from years of believing he controlled every situation he walked into, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose, his radio crackling softly at his shoulder, his gaze locked not on facts, not on evidence, but on a conclusion he had already made the second he saw Marcus behind the wheel of a dark gray sedan idling at the curb. "Step out of the vehicle," Brooks said, voice firm, leaving no room for discussion. And Marcus complied without hesitation, opening the door slowly, stepping out into the cool night air that carried the faint smell of rain and distant traffic, his hands remaining at his sides, relaxed but deliberate. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone even, respectful, but Brooks didn't answer the question, not really, because in his mind the answer had already been written long before this moment. "You fit the description," he replied instead, the words falling flat, vague, yet heavy with implication. And for a second, just a second, the world seemed to pause, like the street itself was holding its breath, because there was no description given, no explanation offered, just a statement that shifted the weight of the situation entirely onto Marcus's shoulders, and around them the murmurs grew louder. Someone across the street whispered, "What happened?" while another voice responded, "I don't know. But they're recording," and just like that, the moment became something bigger than the two men standing under the streetlight. It became a scene, a story unfolding in real time, and Brooks took a step closer, his presence filling the space, his authority pressing in. "Turn around," he said, sharper now, and Marcus hesitated, not out of defiance, but out of something quieter, something harder to name, a moment of calculation, of awareness, as if he understood something about how this would play out that no one else did. "Officer," Marcus said softly, "you might want to be careful with this," and the words weren't loud, weren't aggressive, but they carried a weight that didn't quite fit the situation, a subtle shift in tone that went unnoticed by most but not entirely lost in the silence that followed. Brooks let out a short laugh, dismissive, the kind of laugh that brushed off anything that didn't fit his narrative. "Yeah, I've heard that before," he replied, shaking his head as he reached for the cuffs on his belt, the metallic glint catching the streetlight for just a second before disappearing into his grip, and then, in a movement that felt both quick and drawn out at the same time, he stepped behind Marcus and secured his wrists, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the open air, and just like that, the line had been crossed, not with force, not with chaos, but with something quieter, something colder, the quiet certainty of a decision made without question, and the crowd reacted the way crowds always do, a mix of curiosity and discomfort, some stepping closer, others hanging back. A woman holding her phone whispered, "He didn't even do anything," while a man beside her muttered, "They always say that," and through it all Marcus remained still, his expression unchanged, his breathing steady, his eyes lifting slightly as if taking in the entire scene, memorizing it, understanding it, while Brooks guided him toward the patrol car, his voice rising just enough to assert control. "You can explain everything downtown," he said, and for a moment it seemed like that was the end of it, just another stop, another arrest, another story that would fade into the noise of the city. But then something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle change in the rhythm of the night, a low hum of engines approaching from down the block, headlights cutting through the damp air, and if you were standing there, really paying attention, you might have noticed the way Marcus's gaze flickered, not with fear, not with anger, but with something else entirely, something that didn't belong to a man who had just been placed in handcuffs, something that hinted, quietly but unmistakably, that this moment wasn't what it seemed, and that the man Officer Brooks thought he had just arrested was not the man he believed him to be. The faint hum of approaching engines grew louder, not aggressive, not urgent, but deliberate, like something moving with purpose rather than panic, and the headlights that had once been distant now stretched across the wet pavement in long, steady beams that cut through the uneasy tension surrounding the scene, causing a subtle shift in the crowd as people instinctively turned their heads, their phones following the movement, capturing not just what was happening but what was about to happen. And Officer Daniel Brooks felt it before he fully registered it, that slight disruption in control, that almost invisible fracture in the certainty he had been standing on just seconds ago. yet he tightened his grip on routine, on procedure, guiding Marcus Reed toward the open back door of the patrol car. "Watch your head," he said mechanically, though his voice lacked the earlier edge, as if something in the air had softened it without his permission, and Marcus paused for the briefest moment. Before stepping forward, his eyes drifting not to the car, not to the ground, but toward the line of black vehicles now pulling up along the curb one by one, their engines quieting in near-perfect synchronization, doors opening with calm precision, and the crowd reacted instantly, whispers rising, curiosity sharpening, because these were not ordinary cars, not marked units, not anything that fit the familiar pattern of a routine arrest, and a man near the front of the crowd lowered his phone. Just enough to mutter, "Who are they?" while another voice answered in a low tone, "That does not look like local police," and Brooks turned his head slightly, just enough to see them, just enough for doubt to slip in. Where certainty had been, but not enough for him to step back, not yet, because stepping back would mean acknowledging something he was not ready to admit, so he continued, one hand on the car door, the other gesturing for Marcus to get inside, but Marcus did not move, not this time, not immediately. Instead he stood there, composed, the faint reflection of the flashing lights dancing across his face as his gaze met Brooks again, calm, unwavering, almost patient, and for the first time since the encounter began, Brooks hesitated, just a fraction of a second, just long enough for the moment to stretch, for the silence to deepen, for the sound of approaching footsteps to become unmistakable, measured, confident, and when the first figure stepped into the light, dressed in a dark suit, posture straight, expression focused, everything about him spoke of authority that did not need to be announced. The kind of authority that did not rely on volume or force but simply existed, and he walked directly toward them without breaking stride, without asking permission, without acknowledging the crowd, his attention fixed entirely on the man standing in handcuffs. "Sir," he said, his voice clear, controlled, and the single word carried more weight than anything that had been said all night, and Brooks felt it immediately, the shift, the imbalance, the sudden realization that the situation he thought he understood was no longer his to control. "I am going to need you to step away." The man continued, not raising his voice, not issuing a command in the traditional sense, but making a statement that left no room for interpretation, and Brooks blinked, confusion flashing across his face as his grip on the situation began to loosen. "Excuse me," he responded, the confidence in his tone now thinner, strained, as if trying to hold onto something that was already slipping. And the man in the suit did not react to the question, did not engage in argument, instead he reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and produced a badge, holding it just long enough for Brooks to see, to process, to understand, and in that instant, everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because the badge did not represent a department Brooks was used to dealing with, it represented something higher, something that did not arrive by accident, something that did not make mistakes about who it was there for, and Brooks's posture shifted, his shoulders tightening, his stance adjusting unconsciously as the weight of the moment settled in. "There has been a misunderstanding," Brooks said quickly, his words coming faster now, less controlled, as if trying to rewrite the narrative before it fully unraveled, but Marcus remained still, silent, watching, and the man in the suit finally turned his gaze to Brooks fully, his expression unchanged. "Yes," he said calmly, "there has," and the simplicity of the statement carried a finality that left no room for denial, no space for recovery, just the quiet, undeniable truth that the situation had already moved beyond anything Brooks could fix, and somewhere in the crowd, a phone captured the exact moment when the balance of power shifted, when the man who thought he was in control realized, too late, that he had never been. The air did not erupt into chaos, it did something far more unsettling, it went still, the kind of stillness that makes every small sound feel louder, the hum of engines fading into the background, the faint rustle of jackets as the suited agents took their positions, the quiet shifting of feet from the crowd as people leaned in just a little closer, trying to understand what they were witnessing. And in the center of it all Marcus Reed remained exactly where he had been, his hands still restrained, his posture unchanged, as if none of this surprised him, as if he had been expecting this exact moment long before the flashing lights ever touched the pavement, while Officer Daniel Brooks stood frozen between instinct and realization, his training telling him to maintain control, but his instincts whispering that control had already slipped through his fingers, and the man in the suit stepped closer, his presence calm but undeniable, his eyes briefly scanning Marcus before returning to Brooks. "Remove the restraints," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a certainty that did not require repetition, and Brooks did not move at first, not because he did not hear, but because his mind was still catching up, still trying to reconcile the version of events he believed with the one unfolding in front of him. "I need clarification," Brooks said, his voice tighter now, more measured, as if choosing each word carefully might somehow restore order. This individual matched a report, and even as he spoke, the sentence felt incomplete, weaker than it had moments ago, because now it had to stand against something far more solid than assumption. And the man in the suit did not argue, did not challenge. He simply reached into his jacket again and produced a second form of identification, holding it steady, long enough for Brooks to read, to process, to feel the shift settle fully into place. And Brooks's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, the tension in his jaw tightening, the certainty in his eyes dimming, replaced by something else, something closer to doubt. And behind him one of the other agents stepped forward, speaking quietly into a radio, his words low but clear enough to carry "subject confirmed," and that was it. 2 words, simple, precise, but they landed heavier than anything else that night, because they confirmed what Brooks had not even considered, that the man he had placed in handcuffs was not just another name, not just another stop, but someone already known, already expected, already accounted for by a system far beyond his reach. And the crowd felt it too, the shift, the realization that this was no longer a routine interaction, that something bigger was unfolding in front of them. And the phone stayed raised, capturing every second, every glance, every hesitation, because moments like this did not happen often, moments where the script flipped without warning, where the person assumed to hold power suddenly did not. And Brooks exhaled slowly, the breath heavier than it should have been, as his hand moved toward the cuffs, not with confidence, not with authority, but with the careful precision of someone aware that every movement now mattered, that every second was being watched, recorded, remembered. And the metallic click that followed was softer this time, almost swallowed by the silence around it, as the restraints were removed, and Marcus brought his hands forward calmly, rubbing his wrists briefly, not in discomfort, but as if resetting, grounding himself back into the moment. And for the first time since the encounter began, he spoke again, his voice steady, measured, carrying just enough to be heard by those closest. "Thank you," he said, not to Brooks, but to the man in the suit. And the acknowledgement was subtle, but it carried weight, because it confirmed something without fully revealing it, a relationship, an understanding, a level of authority that had not yet been named. And Brooks swallowed, his mind racing now, trying to piece together what he had missed, what he had overlooked, how this situation had shifted so completely without warning. And the man in the suit turned slightly, addressing Marcus directly now, his tone respectful, precise. "We apologize for the delay, sir," he said, and the single word hung in the air longer than anything else. "Sir," formal, deliberate, undeniable, and it echoed through the crowd, through Brooks's thoughts, through the quiet tension that still lingered, because it was not just a word, it was a confirmation, a signal that the man standing there was not who he had appeared to be, not someone to be questioned without cause, not someone to be handled without consequence. And Brooks felt it settle fully then, the realization, the weight of it pressing in, because everything he had assumed, everything he had acted on, had been built on something that no longer held. And as Marcus straightened slightly, adjusting his jacket with calm precision, his eyes met Brooks's one last time, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something far more unsettling, clarity, the kind that does not need to be spoken, because it is already understood. And in that moment, the night did not feel the same anymore, because the power had shifted completely, and there was no way to shift it back. For a moment no one spoke, not the crowd, not the officers, not even the city itself, as if Chicago had paused just long enough to acknowledge what had just unfolded. And Marcus Reed stood there beneath the dim streetlight, adjusting the sleeve of his jacket with quiet precision, his movements unhurried, controlled, the kind of control that did not come from dominance but from certainty, while the man in the suit stepped slightly to his side, not leading, not directing, but aligning himself in a position that made something unmistakably clear without ever needing to say it out loud, that the authority in this moment did not belong to the badge that had flashed earlier under the patrol lights, but to the man who had just been released from them. And Officer Daniel Brooks felt that shift settle deeper with every passing second, the weight of it pressing against his thoughts, his training, his sense of order, because nothing about this fit the pattern he knew, nothing followed the script he had relied on for years, and yet here it was, undeniable, unfolding in front of a crowd that was still watching, still recording, still waiting to see what would happen next. And Brooks cleared his throat, a small, almost involuntary action, as if trying to regain some fragment of control. "If there has been a mistake," he began, his voice measured, cautious now, each word chosen with care, "then we can resolve this professionally," and the sentence hung there, incomplete in its intention, because even as he said it, he knew the balance had already tipped too far to be corrected with simple language, and Marcus turned his head slightly, not fully facing him, just enough to acknowledge the presence behind him, his expression calm, composed, not angry, not satisfied, but something else entirely, something closer to awareness, as if he had seen this moment play out before in different forms, different places, with different faces. "Officer Brooks," Marcus said quietly, and the use of his name alone caused a subtle reaction, a tightening in Brooks's posture, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, because he had never introduced himself, not formally, not in a way that should have carried over, and yet here it was, spoken with certainty, with familiarity, with purpose. "Do you know what the problem is tonight?" Marcus continued, his voice steady, not raised, not confrontational, but carrying just enough weight to hold the attention of everyone within earshot, and Brooks hesitated, just for a second, his instincts searching for the right response, something that would restore footing, something that would shift the narrative back into something he could control, but nothing came, because the answer was not his to give anymore, and Marcus did not wait for one. "The problem is not the stop," he said calmly, "it is the assumption behind it," and the word settled into the space between them, quiet but heavy, the kind of statement that did not need volume to be heard, because it landed somewhere deeper than sound, and the crowd felt it too, the subtle shift from spectacle to something more, something reflective, something uncomfortable in its truth, and Brooks exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he processed the words. Because they were not accusations in the traditional sense, they were not loud or aggressive, but they carried something far more difficult to push back against, clarity, and before he could respond, the man in the suit stepped forward again, his attention returning to Marcus. "We should move," he said, his tone respectful but firm, aware of the growing attention, the phones, the eyes, the weight of the moment expanding beyond the street corner, and Marcus nodded slightly, a simple acknowledgement, before taking a step forward, away from the patrol car, away from the flashing lights that had defined the scene just minutes ago, and as he moved, the agents around him shifted seamlessly, not crowding him, not surrounding him, but creating a quiet path, a controlled space that guided him toward the waiting vehicle, and Brooks watched it all happen in real time, the transition, the reversal, the moment where the person he had detained now walked freely while he remained rooted in place, uncertain, processing. And as Marcus reached the open door of the black vehicle, he paused, just briefly, his hand resting on the frame, his gaze lifting slightly as if considering something, and then he turned back, not fully, just enough for his voice to carry once more across the space that had grown silent again. "Next time," he said evenly, "ask a question before you make a decision," and there was no anger in it, no threat, just a statement, simple, direct, but impossible to ignore, and then he stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him, the sound almost lost beneath the low hum of the engine as it came to life, and one by one the vehicles began to pull away, their lights fading into the distance, leaving behind a street that felt different now, quieter, heavier, as if it had witnessed something it would not easily forget, and Officer Daniel Brooks stood there under the fading glow, the echo of that final sentence lingering in his mind, because it was not just advice, it was a line drawn between who he thought he was and what he had just been shown, and for the first time that night, he did not reach for his radio, he did not speak, he simply stood there, realizing that the badge on his chest had not been the highest authority in that moment. And that realization would follow him long after the lights were gone. The street did not return to normal right away, even after the black vehicles disappeared into the distance and the flashing lights faded from the wet pavement, because something had shifted that could not simply be undone, something that lingered in the air long after the moment itself had passed, and the crowd remained for a few seconds longer than usual, as if waiting for the scene to rewind itself, as if expecting someone to step back into place and restore the version of reality they had witnessed just minutes ago. But nothing happened, no reversal, no correction, just the quiet realization that what they had seen was real, and one by one the phones lowered, conversation sparked in hushed tones, people replaying the moment in their minds, in their recordings, trying to make sense of it, while Officer Daniel Brooks stood alone beside his patrol car, the weight of the silence pressing heavier now than the earlier noise ever had, and his partner, who had remained inside the vehicle during most of the interaction, finally stepped out, his expression uncertain, cautious. "What was that?" he asked, not accusing, not mocking, just genuinely unsure, and Brooks did not answer immediately, because there was no simple answer to give, no clear explanation that would neatly tie together everything that had just unfolded. Instead, he ran a hand across his jaw, his thoughts still catching up, still trying to organize themselves into something that made sense. "I do not know," he admitted quietly, the words unfamiliar on his tongue, because they were not the kind he was used to saying, not in situations where he had always believed he understood the rules. And his partner glanced down the street where the vehicles had disappeared, then back at Brooks. "That did not look like a mistake," he said carefully, and the statement landed harder than expected, because it echoed something Brooks had already begun to realize but had not yet fully accepted, that this was not just an unfortunate misunderstanding, not just a procedural error, it was something deeper, something rooted in the decision he had made before. Any real information was known, and the radio at his shoulder crackled to life, the familiar voice of dispatch breaking through the lingering silence. "Unit 12, status update," and for a moment Brooks simply stared ahead, the question hanging there, simple, routine, yet suddenly complicated, because how do you explain a moment where everything you thought was certain turned out to be incomplete, where the authority you relied on was not enough? And he reached for the radio slowly, his hand steady but his thoughts not. "Situation resolved," he said finally, his voice even but quieter than usual, as if the words carried less weight now than they once had, and dispatch responded with a brief acknowledgement before the line went silent again, leaving Brooks alone with the echo of his own statement, because resolved did not feel accurate, not entirely, not in the way it usually did, and his partner leaned against the side of the car, arms crossed loosely, watching him. "You ever get the feeling you just missed something important?" he asked, and Brooks let out a slow breath, the kind that carried more than just air, the kind that carried realization. "Yeah," he said after a pause, his gaze drifting back to the spot where Marcus had stood earlier, calm, composed, unshaken by everything that had been thrown at him. "I think I did," and the admission settled between them, quiet but undeniable, and as the last few people from the crowd began to disperse, their conversations fading into the background noise of the city, Brooks reached for the door of his patrol car but did not open it right away. Instead, he stood there for another moment, replaying the sequence in his mind, the initial stop, the words he had used, the assumptions he had made without question, and the way it had all unraveled in front of him without warning. And it was not the presence of the agents that stayed with him the most, not the badges, not the authority they carried, it was the calm in Marcus's voice, the certainty behind his words, the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was in a moment where everyone else had already decided otherwise, and that was the part Brooks could not shake, because it forced him to confront something he had never truly examined before, not in this way, not this directly. And as he finally opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, the familiar environment felt different, smaller somehow, as if the space itself had changed along with everything else, and he placed his hands on the steering wheel, staring ahead at the empty street, the reflections of distant lights stretching across the pavement, and for the first time that night, he did not think about procedure, or protocol, or control. He thought about a single sentence, spoken calmly, without anger, without accusation: "Ask a question before you make a decision," and the simplicity of it lingered, heavier than any command he had ever followed, because it was not just about what had happened, it was about what could have been different, what should have been different. And as the engine started and the patrol car pulled away from the curb, the city resumed its rhythm around him, but something inside that moment did not move on so easily, because some lessons do not arrive loudly, they arrive quietly, in the space left behind when everything else fades, and they stay there, waiting to be understood. The city moved on, but the moment did not leave him. It followed Officer Daniel Brooks through every turn of the wheel as the patrol car rolled down dimly lit streets, past late-night diners glowing under fluorescent lights, past gas stations where strangers stood under buzzing canopies, past sidewalks where people walked unaware that somewhere just minutes away, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And inside the car the silence stretched longer than usual, not the comfortable silence of routine patrol, but the kind that forced thoughts to surface, thoughts that did not arrive all at once but slowly, piece by piece, like fragments of a puzzle he had never thought to solve before. And his partner glanced at him once, then again, noticing the way Brooks's grip on the steering wheel tightened and relaxed without rhythm. "You are quiet," he said finally, not pushing, just observing, and Brooks nodded slightly. Eyes fixed on the road ahead, just thinking, he replied, but even that felt incomplete, because thinking did not fully describe what was happening. It was more than that, it was replaying, analyzing, questioning, something he had not done in years, not like this, not after a stop, not after a moment that had once felt routine but now carried a different weight, and the words echoed again in his mind, not loud, not demanding, just present. Ask a question before you make a decision. And the simplicity of it unsettled him more than any confrontation could have, because it exposed something he had never labeled before, something that had operated quietly beneath the surface of every call, every stop, every judgment made in a matter of seconds. And as the car slowed at a red light, the reflection of it cast a dull glow across the dashboard. Brooks leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as if trying to release the tension that had settled into his chest, but it did not leave. It stayed there, persistent, because now it had a shape, a form, something he could not ignore, and he thought back to the beginning of the night, to the moment he first saw Marcus Reed sitting in that car, and how quickly the decision had formed, how natural it had felt, how certain he had been without needing confirmation, without needing evidence, and that was the part that stayed with him the most, not the agents, not the badge, not the reveal, but the speed of his own assumption, the ease of it, the confidence that came without question. And his partner shifted slightly in his seat, glancing at him again. "You are going to report it?" he asked, and the question hung there, simple on the surface but layered beneath. Because reporting it meant more than just writing down what happened, it meant acknowledging it, defining it, putting it into words that could not be taken back. And Brooks did not answer right away, because he did not yet know how to explain something he was still trying to understand himself. "Yeah," he said eventually, his voice lower now, more grounded. "I will," and the light turned green, the car moving forward again. But his thoughts remained behind for a moment, anchored to that street corner, to that moment where everything had shifted without warning, and somewhere across the city, in a building far removed from flashing lights and crowded sidewalks, Marcus Reed sat in the back of the vehicle as it moved through the quiet streets, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, while the man in the suit beside him spoke in a calm, measured tone. "The timing was not ideal," he said, reviewing something on a tablet, "but the exposure may actually work in our favor, and—" Marcus nodded slightly, his gaze drifting out the window as the city passed by in blurred reflections. "Sometimes it takes a moment like that," he replied, his voice steady, thoughtful, "for people to see what is already there." And the agent glanced at him briefly, then back at the screen. "Internal Affairs has been building the case for months," he said. "Tonight just added something we could not replicate in a report." And Marcus did not respond immediately, because he knew that was true. That no document, no file, no internal memo could fully capture what had been revealed in real time, in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, in front of a system that often moved too slowly to confront itself. And as the vehicle continued through the city, the distance between the two men and that street corner grew, but the impact of what happened there did not fade with it. It expanded, quietly, steadily, reaching beyond that moment into places neither of them could fully see yet. And back in the patrol car, Brooks drove in silence, the city lights stretching ahead of him, familiar yet different now, because for the first time in a long time, he was not just watching the streets, he was questioning the way he saw them, and that question, once it had formed, was not going away. The report sat and finished on the screen longer than it should have, the cursor blinking steadily as if marking time, as if waiting for Officer Daniel Brooks to decide not just what to write but how much truth he was willing to face. And the station around him carried on with its usual rhythm, phones ringing in the distance, officers moving through the halls, paperwork stacking on desks under harsh fluorescent lights, but none of it felt quite the same. Not after what had happened, because routine only works when nothing challenges it, and tonight something had, something quiet but undeniable, and Brooks leaned back slightly in his chair, staring at the screen where the words "incident summary" remained untouched, because every version he tried to form in his mind felt incomplete, too simple, too clean, like it was leaving something out that could no longer be ignored. And across the room another officer laughed at something on his phone. The sound brief, normal, almost jarring in its contrast to the weight pressing down on Brooks's thoughts, and he looked down at his hands for a moment, resting on the desk, still, steady, the same hands that had acted without hesitation earlier that night. And he thought about that moment again, not the outcome, not the agents or the reveal, but the beginning, the instant where everything had been decided before a single real question had been asked. And that was where the discomfort lived now, not in what had happened after, but in What had happened before, and the door to the office opened quietly, his supervisor stepping in with a folder in hand. His expression neutral but focused. "Brooks," he said, setting the folder down on the desk, "we need to talk about tonight." And the words were expected, but they still landed with a certain weight, because they confirmed what Brooks already knew, that the moment on that street corner had not stayed there, it had followed him here, into this room, onto this report, into something that would now be examined, reviewed, understood by others. And Brooks nodded once, sitting up slightly. "I was going to file the report," he said, his voice steady, controlled, and his supervisor glanced at the blank screen before looking back at him. "Good," he replied, "because this is already getting attention," and he tapped the folder lightly. "Someone recorded it, uploaded it, and now it is moving faster than we can contain." And Brooks felt that settle in, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of what he had already sensed. That the moment had not just been witnessed, it had been captured, shared, expanded beyond the street, beyond the city, into something that would reach people who had never been there but would still form opinions, still ask questions, still see what had unfolded without context, without explanation, just the raw moment itself. And his supervisor continued, his tone measured, not accusatory, but direct. "Internal Affairs is already reviewing the footage," he said. "And they are going to want your statement to match what actually happened." And Brooks met his gaze, holding it for a second longer than usual, because that word, actually, carried more weight now than it ever had before, and he nodded again, slower this time. "It will," he said, and for the first time since sitting down, his hand moved toward the keyboard, not hesitating this time, not pausing, but beginning to type, the words coming more carefully now, more deliberately, not just describing actions, but acknowledging decisions. And across the city, in a secured office far removed from the noise of the station, Marcus Reed stood near a window overlooking the skyline, the lights stretching out across the horizon like a quiet reminder of how much was always happening beyond a single moment. And the man in the suit stood a few feet behind him, reviewing updates on a screen. "The footage is already trending," he said, his tone neutral, analytical. "Public response is building quickly," and Marcus did not turn, his gaze steady on the city below. "It was never just about the footage," he replied calmly. "It was about what people recognize when they see it," and the agent nodded slightly, understanding the distinction. Because the power of that moment was not in its drama, not in its spectacle, but in its familiarity, the quiet recognition of something that had happened before, in different places, to different people, and now it had been seen clearly, without interruption, without distortion, and Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of it settling not as a burden, but as a responsibility, because moments like that did not just reveal problems, they created opportunities for something to change. If people were willing to see it. And back at the station, Brooks continued typing, each word forming more carefully than the last, because now he understood that this report was not just documentation, it was reflection, and for the first time in his career, he was not just writing what happened, he was confronting why it happened, and that difference, once recognized, was not something he could ignore anymore. By morning the story was no longer contained within a single street corner or a single report, it had spread across screens, across conversations, across a city that was now watching something it could not easily ignore, and inside the precinct the atmosphere felt different, not dramatically, not loudly, but subtly altered in a way that made every glance linger a second longer, every conversation lower in tone. Because everyone had seen it or heard about it, and even those who had not watched the footage yet understood enough to know that something had shifted. And Officer Daniel Brooks sat at his desk as the final lines of his report came together, each sentence more deliberate than the last, not because he was being careful with how it sounded, but because for the first time he was being careful with what it meant, and the words on the screen no longer felt like routine documentation, they felt like a record of something that had exposed more than just a moment, something that had revealed a pattern. And as he read through it one last time, his supervisor returned, standing quietly beside him, reviewing the screen without interrupting, and after a few seconds he nodded once, not in approval, not exactly, but in acknowledgement. "That is accurate," he said, and the word carried weight, because accuracy now meant more than facts, it meant honesty, and Brooks leaned back slightly, his eyes lingering on the report as if seeing it for what it truly was, not just a requirement, but a reflection, and across the room a television mounted high on the wall played a new segment, the volume low but the images clear, clips from the footage looping on repeat, the flashing lights, the crowd, the moment the agents arrived. And the headline beneath it read in bold letters about a growing investigation into conduct and oversight, and one of the officers nearby shook his head slowly. That escalated fast, he muttered, and another responded quietly. It always does when people see it clearly, and Brooks did not turn to look. He did not need to, because he already understood that the moment had moved beyond him, beyond his report, into something larger, something that would continue to unfold whether he was part of it or not. And across the city, Marcus Reed sat in a conference room surrounded by quiet focus, a series of screens displaying reports, timelines, and now the footage that had become central to everything. And the man in the suit stood nearby, pointing to specific sections. Public response is accelerating, he said, but more importantly, internal responses are starting to align. And Marcus watched the screen in silence for a moment, the image of himself standing under the streetlight frozen mid-frame, calm, composed, unreactive. And he knew that was what people were noticing, not just the action, but the contrast. The stillness against the assumption, the clarity against the confusion. This is what we needed, the agent continued, not staged, not filtered, just real. And Marcus nodded slightly, his gaze steady, because he understood that truth did not always need amplification, sometimes it just needed visibility, and that moment had provided exactly that. And back at the precinct, Brooks finally stood, stepping away from his desk as if putting physical distance between himself and the version of the night that had existed before he started writing, and he walked past the television, his eyes catching the footage for just a second. The version of himself standing under those lights, confident, certain, unaware. And then the shift, the hesitation, the realization, and he paused for a moment longer than he intended, watching not as the officer in the video, but as someone seeing it from the outside for the first time, and it felt different, it looked different, because now he could see what others saw, not just the action, but the assumption behind it, and he exhaled slowly, turning away, because understanding it did not erase it, but it changed something, something that would follow him into every decision from that point forward. And as he stepped outside the precinct into the cool morning air, the city looked the same. The street still busy, the sound still familiar, but his perspective was not, because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, and that clarity, quiet and persistent, would now shape everything that came next. Days passed, but the moment did not fade. It evolved, it settled into conversations at kitchen tables, into debates on television panels, into quiet reflections in places where people had once accepted things without question, and across Chicago the story continued to ripple outward. Not because it was loud, but because it was clear, and clarity has a way of staying with people longer than noise ever could. And Officer Daniel Brooks felt that more with each passing shift, not through confrontation, not through discipline, but through something far less visible and far more lasting, awareness, because every stop now carried a pause, every interaction began with a question that had not been there before, and it was subtle, almost unnoticeable to anyone else. But to him it was constant, a quiet recalibration of something he had once taken for granted. And one evening as the sun dipped low over the city, casting long shadows across the streets, Brooks found himself parked near a familiar intersection, watching traffic move steadily past, and for a moment he simply sat there, not waiting for a call, not reacting, just observing, and he thought about how quickly everything could have gone differently that night, how easily the moment could have passed unnoticed if not for the timing, the presence. The truth that had stepped into the light at exactly the right second, and he leaned back slightly, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, as if no longer gripping control but holding responsibility instead. And somewhere across the city Marcus Reed walked through a quiet hallway lined with glass and steel, his footsteps measured, his posture composed, and people he passed nodded respectfully, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Recognition of someone who carried authority without needing to display it. And he paused briefly near a window overlooking the skyline, the same city that had witnessed that moment now continuing its rhythm below. And the man in the suit approached once more, a small tablet in hand. The review board has completed their initial findings, he said calmly. Policy revisions are already being drafted. And Marcus nodded once, not with satisfaction, but with understanding. Because this was never about a single outcome, it was about the chain reaction that followed. The quiet shifts that happened behind the scenes, the adjustments that would shape future decisions long after the headlines faded. And he turned slightly, his gaze steady. It only matters if it lasts, he said, his voice even, grounded, and the agent nodded in agreement, because change that does not endure is not change at all. And back on the street Brooks stepped out of his patrol car, the evening air cool against his skin. And across the sidewalk a young man stood beside his car. Looking uncertain, glancing between his phone and the officer approaching him, and Brooks slowed his steps, just slightly, enough to notice the hesitation, enough to recognize something familiar in that moment, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, but different now. "Good evening," he said. "Can I ask what is going on here?" And the difference was small, almost invisible, but it mattered, because the question came before the assumption, and the young man exhaled, some of the tension leaving his posture as he explained, and Brooks listened, not waiting to confirm a conclusion, but to understand the situation itself, and it was in that moment, quiet and unremarkable to anyone watching, that the real shift revealed itself, not in headlines, not in footage, but in action, in the space between reaction and decision. And as the conversation ended and the young man drove away without incident, Brooks stood there for a second longer, watching the taillights disappear into the distance, and he realized something that had not been clear before, that authority is not proven by control, it is defined by restraint, by the willingness to pause, to question, to see before acting. And as he returned to his car, the city lights flickering on around him, he no longer felt the need to hold on to the version of control he once believed in, because something better had taken its place, something quieter, something stronger, something that did not need to announce itself to exist, and somewhere high above the city skyline, the reflection of those same lights shimmered against the glass, a reminder that every moment, no matter how small, has the power to reshape what comes next. And in the end, the truth did not arrive with force, it arrived with clarity, and that clarity, once seen, became impossible to ignore, because he thought he understood what it meant to enforce the law, but that night, he learned what it meant to respect it.